Thanks to everybody for joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are in the world. And welcome back to our final Send Searchlights for 2024. A couple of usual reminders in terms of the housekeeping before we get started. We'd ask that you'd stay on mute, but do engage with us in chat if you've got any questions to clarify the topic. Or indeed, I'm going to invite you to share some ideas with us in the chat today. But any questions about possible future webinars, do pop those into your registration form that you'll receive after today's episode, along with the recording and any other things that we might mention therein. So today's episode, well, this time of the year lends itself, doesn't it, to periods of reflection and preparation for the new year. And so with that sentiment in mind, Polly, Debbie and I decided that we are going to take some time to think back over the last year and some conversations that we've each individually had with teachers or practitioners in schools or settings to celebrate the work that you guys are doing. And what we hope to do then is to make some connections between those and some of those highlights that we've seen with some opportunities for learning. So we might direct you back to some previous episodes where you might have missed some potential content that could be useful, or even make a suggestion for a bit of recommended reading. I don't know that it's something you necessarily would like to take on over the winter break, but it is certainly something that we would enjoy sharing with you and hope that you'd find valuable. But before we get to that, we wanted to start with a really big thank you to you all. Across this year's Send Searchlights, we've had registrations from over 1,600 practitioners across 50 plus countries, and we've received in excess of 160 questions across a range of different themes. So it's been a really exciting experience for us to support you in answering those questions. And we've tried to do that as many questions as we can in the 9 episodes that we've hosted, but we are looking forward to coming back in January and tackling more of those questions with the able support of some exciting experts who are going to continue to join us and guide you to some resources that we hope will be useful. So let's get our reflections underway. And as I mentioned, as we do, please feel free in the chat to share any of your own personal highlights. We'd love to hear those, and or professional reading recommendations, because I'm certain that I will benefit from that, and there may be others in the chat who would too. Now, Debbie is with us today, but she's having some technical issues with her camera, so she's going to keep that off, but we will be able to hear her. So Debbie, can I pass over to you and ask you to kick us off with some reflections?
Yes, thank you, Emma. As we come towards the end of yet another busy year in the practice side of the company, and as I look back over the year, I would like to reflect on a subject that we covered in our September webinar, which was inclusion. This brought to my mind a conversation that I had had with a school recently who was struggling to get 1 or 2 of their students to engage with accelerated reading and quizzing. The students were disruptive and were stopping other students from participating in the lesson. I suggested that the school try a strategy that I had used when I was working in an SEMH school, and I was using the Renaissance products. I had one student who was displaying very similar behaviour that the school was encountering. He was a year 9 student with a reading age of approximately 9 years and 3 months. He was disengaged with learning and was disruptive in lessons, resulting in him having to work on his reading on a one-to-one basis with a member of staff from our Behaviour and Education Support Team, or BEST as we used to call them. And he had to work away from the classroom. As he was leaving the class on one occasion, he made a throwaway comment. "I would read if there were any decent books in this library." This made me think, and as a result, I arranged to take the class to a local bookshop, and I allowed them to choose 4 or 5 books each, with the proviso that if there was not a quiz available on the book, they would write one for me using the teacher-made quiz feature on Accelerated Reader. The students concerned chose 4 graphic novels that did not have quizzes and 2 fiction novels that did. He read the 4 graphic novels and wrote me a quiz after each one. And surprisingly, he scored 100% each time. He then went on to read both of the fiction novels and scored highly on those as well. I would like to say that this made him a prolific reader and I couldn't keep him out of the library after that, but I would be lying. However, he did rejoin his class, and he was then included back into the classroom environment, and he left our school from post 16 with a reading age of 13 years and 6 months. My story also links back to an earlier Searchlights session with Becky, where she touched upon adaptations for all learners. I was hoping that by taking the whole class into the bookshop, this would enable the young learner to share the same experience as his peers, and that by meeting the needs of one, I would be supporting the needs of all. If you would like to delve further into inclusion, I can recommend these books: Special Education Needs, A Guide for Inclusive Practice, Pia, Lindsay, Reed, Gavin, and you can get that from amazon.co.uk. Meeting Special Education Needs in Primary Classrooms, Inclusion and How to Do It, and that's by Briggs and Sue. I would now like to pass you back to Emma to continue with our reflections.
Thank you ever so much, Debbie. So it's been a particularly busy year for me as the education specialist for SEND and Wellbeing. I'm really privileged to be able to speak to colleagues in schools, in multi-academy trusts, in international schools groups about how they're using our resources to support identification and provision for learners who might be experiencing barriers. And that knowledge helps me to shape the evolution of our products to meet the needs of those colleagues who are using them. And that was me at one point, so I really appreciate the feedback that people continue to offer. And in a recent conversation that I had with Stacey Bradwell, who's the head of inclusion at one of the GEMS schools in Dubai, Stacey and I were talking about the kind of variance in data confidence that SENCOs or heads of inclusion might have. Some people really loving the numbers and other people feeling like there's just too many of them and not really sure what to do or where to start. And I was really pleased to hear how valuable she found the tool, the Cat4 Learner guide and the reading support pathways to help what she described as a better visualization experience for the data as they were telling the story of the students' needs and that kind of wider contextual picture, which is so important and we've spoken about so much this year. And that comment resonated with me again when I was reading a book that's come out very recently by David Bartram and Natalie Packer called Beyond Boundaries, which is a really brilliant compendium of case studies from leaders across schools and MATs in the UK. Although I would say, having worked overseas, that the learning is just as applicable if you are based in an international setting. And in that book, CEO of Woodland Academy Trust, Nav Sanghara, described the Trust's approach to cultivating excellence for learners with SEND. And I want to share you a quote. So I'm just going to look my eyes down as I read from that. So Nav says, our journey begins with the understanding of the unique needs of SEND learners in primary education. Each learner's needs are unique as their personalities and therefore require a tailored approach. It's crucial to recognise that high expectations do not equate to a one-size-fits-all approach. Rather, they come from focusing on every learner's potential to achieve their personal best. So, as we have said many times before, standardized assessment data like that you might get from some of our assessment does play a really valuable role towards understanding an individual's strengths and challenges, but it is a part of a much bigger picture for the learner and should always be considered alongside wider context to avoid the one-size-fits-all approach that Nav referenced. So understanding an accurate picture of need is important. We all know that, and it's important throughout the year, but it's especially important at key points of transition to ensure that a learner can navigate that change seamlessly and that their teachers have a consistency to the support that enables them to thrive in new environments and experiences. So the episode I'd like to take you back to was from April, where we shared some practical ways in which you could begin to prepare for transition. a process that we all know in our role starts well ahead of the changing academic years. So if that's something that you're beginning to think about, then maybe do take a moment to revisit that episode from April for some ideas on how you might use your data to support that planning. And now I'm going to hand to Polly for her reflections.
Thanks, Emma. It always interests me with transitions. And I think something that stood out to me when I was a Senko was actually transitions are happening all the time, not just those key points that we always sort of jump to of sort of changes in the year or changes into the next academic year, all those sorts of things. But anyway, it's been a busy year for me too. I'm now well into my second year of being an education advisor since leaving the school setting. And obviously with time comes new experiences and opportunities. So I felt really lucky to be able to continue to develop my learning around SEND. And from a work perspective, gain a better understanding of some of our products, so the screeners and the valuable data they produce. One of my particular highlights for this year was attending the Dimensions of Dyslexia, which is an Evidence and Practice International Conference. So that was hosted by the British Dyslexia Association back in June. The year is whizzing away, I can't believe that was June. But this was something we did reflect on in our October episode, where we not only looked at the sort of the history of dyslexia, but shared some of the highlights from the conference. So bringing that sort of back to my role as an educational advisor, similar to Emma, I feel privileged to meet with a whole variety of schools during just one working week. So these can be small primaries, large secondaries, specialist settings, international schools. And with each of those, they bring their own unique and interesting context. So very recently, I met with a school who had some queries about their dyslexia screener data. So as per every consultation that we prepare for, I was fully prepared to explain what the subtest assessed, how to read the data. However, what transpired was a particularly valuable and insightful conversation. Every conversation I have is amazing, but this one particularly resonated with me. So we looked at two different students' results. The screener had produced similar outcomes, but actually the individual results were very different. One of the students had a particularly interesting profile, and the school asked a very valid set of questions, asking perhaps whether the student had not engaged with the test. And at this point, I asked about that contextual information, again, that Emma mentioned that was really important in putting those pieces together. So what led them to do the screener? What were they seeing in the classroom? What were their concerns? Just to see if this would give us any further clues as to how we would interpret the results. We also considered other assessments, and we looked at those CAT 4 results. And it was at this point when we did this, we could see some correlations between some of the results. And putting those assessments together, we could see that actually the student appeared to have a strength in the more pictorial diagram-based subtests, so both in the dyslexia screener and the CAT 4, which just goes to show that based on that data alone, it did reveal that potentially the student had some barrier to learning, but perhaps it wasn't dyslexia in isolation. We were finding those strengths, but also finding those areas of challenge. And it was at this point that the light bulb sort of pinged for the school, as they could see how using the data and triangulating it gave them a greater insight into the strengths and challenges of the learner, again, against their own observations, the views of the parents and teacher judgment. And by the end of the meeting, they basically concluded that they felt that their toolbox was a little bit fuller. They were empowered to use their data in that wider context, and felt much more confident and prepared to share the information with the students' parents. And it gave them excitement with the data. So like Emma was saying, that sometimes schools can find data quite overwhelming, but actually they were then excited to use the data to find out more. So to bring it back and conclude my reflection, it is about the importance of data triangulation, but also reminds us that when we're considering profiles that may be a specific learning difficulty, such as dyslexia, it still isn't a one-size-fits-all barriers to learning, and there's always more to learn and find out about our students. So as we mentioned in our October episode, here in the UK, the definition of dyslexia is undergoing review. And if you did miss that session, like all our other Searchlight episodes, it is available on our website. And during that session, we suggested lots of further reading. I won't read it out now. There were lots of complicated papers and titles, but if that is of interest to you to find out about those readings, do go and have a look at the October episode again. which does bring us on to looking ahead. So next month in January, in the new year, Dr. Helen Ross will be joining us to delve more into that dyslexia discussion. So we really hope you can join us for what is going to be a super insightful session. But for now, I will hand over to Debbie, who is going to wrap up for us today.
Thank you, Polly. Thank you all very much for joining us today. And I would like to take this opportunity to suggest that if you are interested in investigating any of the topics that have been covered today in more detail, please do look at accessing some of the reading materials mentioned, or look back and reflect on our previous SEND Searchlights webinars, which are all available on our website. As Polly mentioned, next month we are very privileged to be joined by Dr. Helen Ross, who will be able to answer any more of your questions on dyslexia. Please do keep sending us your other SEND questions as well, as we will continue to answer your questions related to practice and assessment, as well as sharing more practical tips for your everyday practice. All that remains now is to thank you all once again for joining us, and to wish those of you who are celebrating the holidays a very Merry Christmas and a happy and prosperous New Year. We look forward to seeing you all again on the 14th of January.